Thank you everyone for coming or joining us on Zoom today for strategic sessions. It's going to be the part 1, critical incident stress management. And thank you, Stephen, so much for allowing us your time and to teach this class. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see that. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Super. So yeah, thank you for having me. I work at Ada County Medical Society, and I have the privilege when I'm not planning events for doctors, which I'm not doing a lot of lately, of being able to do some online education. And we spend a lot of time at our organization thinking about how to help our physicians and other parts of the medical community deal with the stresses that they experience, which, as you imagine right now, are extreme. But you are all, as small business owners, also experiencing extreme stress, I would imagine. And so wanted to talk about how to adapt these principles, which are really their techniques that are used by law enforcement and EMS and FEMA and other places like that to de-escalate stress after, let's say, a mass tragedy or a disaster or a terrorist incident or really any kind of critical incident that a team of people has experienced. So even though you may own or operate a business that's just you and maybe your partner or spouse, or whether it's a group of 5 or 10 or 20 plus, whatever it is, in any situation, you're going to come across critical incidents like we're in right now and going to deal with the stress that comes from that. So there's a well-researched CISM, it's called Critical Incident Stress Management, CISM, and I'll refer to it that way. It's well researched and is used really nationally and globally. And so we're not going to teach CISM as in terms of you learning how to do this for like a single type of an emergency incident, although those kind of things might come up, an injury or possibly a death in the workplace could happen. Really what I want to teach you is let's look at these principles, and then let's talk about those things and how can we apply them in a small business setting. So I have a friend who lived in Joplin, Missouri in 2011, which this is a picture of the tornado that went through there. And he said that when they emerged from this E5, hurricane, they came up out of their shelter and they looked around, and he just said, I didn't even recognize the landscape. I mean, there was nothing there to even kind of like pinpoint what stuff. And so all this shock and confusion kind of set in, and slowly they got oriented to where they even were. And I think that as we begin to move back into our lives at a somewhat more normal sense, we're going to have a little bit of that shock. We're going to not see the regular landmarks, that we see in business or in society. And so we may feel a lot of discombobulation, and we want to have some tools, not only for ourselves, but also employees, to know how to deal with that so that they can re-engage as quickly as possible into business. So I want to start by saying it's really important that we acknowledge to ourselves and to other people that this really is a disaster, it's a crisis, it's an emergency, and acknowledge that as a fact is important. And without getting political, I know that there's some narratives out there that, oh, this is a fake crisis or whatever, and that could be just maybe a natural reaction because we want somebody to blame for this, right? And so whether it was these people who created this or whatever, we don't have to talk about that. Whatever you think about this, the disease, or how the government is or isn't handling it or whatever, we know that the real-time impact is a real thing and that we are all experiencing that, whatever the basis of that is. So that's what we want to focus on. And really, when we talk about critical incident stress management, we don't really have to focus as much on the incident itself, but on the repercussions that it's having in a person's life. So usually we think of disasters as happening like an earthquake or Pearl Harbor or 9/11 as a single episode occurring in time in a specific location of intensity that brings about stress. But this isn't that kind of a thing. This is really different, and yet it has some of the same effects. Number one, it affects everybody, but it affects everybody differently. And I always think about, look at these pictures of a hurricane, and you go, how could this one house be still standing after everything else around it is demolished? It seems so random. It doesn't seem fair, right? And so we are dealing with that, right? Because some families are doing maybe just fine with this. They feel like this is an extended spring break. They got their family, they're safe, they're having some quality time with them. And not only that, they just got a check in the mail from the government to put in their bank account. So they're feeling fine. And across the street, you may have a family that this has completely demolished their life, right? Financially, they don't want their kids home. They're dealing with schooling their kids while trying to work either at home or going away. Or you have, even in my realm, doctor's offices, some who are very busy and others who are sitting on their thumbs waiting for patients because they're not considered an essential service yet, again, or people are afraid of coming into the ER. So everybody's experiencing differently, but everybody's experiencing this. And so it's important for us to realize that everyone's got a different experience in this. The other thing is that this is a very highly mobile but invisible enemy, right? It was like guerrilla warfare, or it's like even when George Bush said after 9/11, he said, this is a new kind of war that we really don't understand and haven't experienced yet. And we have to be patient because this isn't going to be the same type of thing where we just drop a 2-ton bomb on them. This is going to pop up here and there for some extended period of time. The symptoms we know are bewildering and they're not even consistent all the time. This could be everywhere, it could be nowhere. All these types of things. It's a different type of disaster. And then finally, maybe not comprehensively finally, but this is a slow moving train wreck, right? This is unfolding before us, not in a single space and time, but it's going to go on. The projection of the deaths are immense. I mean, this is a train wreck in just our own nation. But then there's going to be the unfolding deaths of despair that are projected in some news accounts. 75,000 within 10 years, whatever happens with unemployment and economic recovery. And so these types of things are going to have waves and waves of shock waves that kind of continue to go out, even after when we had our earthquake at the beginning of April, that there was a few aftershocks, right? And we know that this is also going to have that same type of thing. So how are we going to walk employees through this? How are we going to handle this? And so what I want to do is not look at only what the bad thing is, but what is the opportunity. And I really believe that this is an opportunity, if it doesn't already exist in your business, this is an opportunity for us to inject our humanity into workplaces so that they're not so cold, they're not so sterile, they're not so efficient that they kill, the souls of employees. Now, I'm assuming if you own a small business, it's probably not like that anyway, right? But every single act of kindness that we can do in a workplace to help people cope, and whether that's your employees or your coworkers or your customers or your vendors or whatever it is, every single opportunity we have to inject humanity into that, I think makes business better, and is why we do business in the first place, which is to connect with each other. And so before I ramble on too much longer, I'd just like to ask you, have you had any small meaningful moment, kind of human interactions during the past two months where you felt like, wow, I really felt treated like a person? Would anybody like to share something like that?
Yeah, I'll share. One thing I've noticed is because everybody is going through this together, when I'm talking to whether it's a customer or talking to a vendor of ours, everybody just is a little bit more understanding of each other. Having video calls with somebody and their dog pops up and they hold them and everybody talks about it, or my ping pong table is my desk now, and it does see there is more of a connection with people, just because you're truly asking how are you doing, how are you coping, so that has been kind of a silver lining to this. I feel like we're getting to know people better.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Vicki. Yeah, and I think that's been true for me too. Even I was on a tech support chat the other day, and clearly somebody from another country, and she actually initially goes, "How are you doing?" or "How is your family?" or something like that, and I'm like, "Well, we're kind of like what I explained at the beginning. We're doing okay. There's this and that. How about your family, and how's this affecting your community?" And so I think there's this opportunity for us to normalize the caring and compassion and connecting that we all want out of life if we don't already have that in our workplace. And so I encourage us that we move along thinking about that. So here's your new mantra. If you're dealing with post-traumatic stress, this is an opportunity for us to destigmatize mental health issues. It's an opportunity for us to normalize the fact that stress is a normal part of life, and especially Corona, that this is that stress is a natural reaction. And so this mantra, and in fact, I'm going to ask you all to unmute yourself, and we're just going to say this together, because this is something that as you go through debriefing employees or meeting with people, this is a great thing just to, you know, stress, and let's just say this together. Stress is a normal reaction in a normal person to an abnormal. Don't you guys go to church or anything? Like, can't you, you know, stress is a normal reaction in a normal person to an abnormal event.
Event.
Good, good. I'm really proud of you guys there. Now, let's just stop and together, let's react to that statement. How do you feel when you hear that statement?
Like, what does it do for me though? You know,
Yeah.
I'm a very action-oriented person, and so sometimes I'll like recognize that probably my emotional reactions are normal, and then I want to know the actions of like, okay, well, I still want to navigate through it like as quick as possible. It still doesn't feel normal when you're out of a normal routine of sorts.
Yeah, good. Thanks for sharing, Megan. Anybody else?
Just kind of like what Megan said, it makes you feel like you're not alone. Like you're like, we all understand this is abnormal, but we're all feeling it, so we're all in this together.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, you know, as ambitious, productivity oriented Westerners, you know, we feel oftentimes that when we're not on our A game at all times, we feel like something's wrong with me. My goodness, how come I can't be, you know, on at 100%? And so I think that this gives us permission to feel human. And I think a lot of times in our very ambitious endeavors, when we're not completely on it, we feel like, well, something's wrong with me. No, we're just being human together. And so I think that as we normalize stress and people's whatever the reactions are, and we'll talk about what those might be in a kind of a post-traumatic situation, it's like, oh, this is that. I saw an article, it said grief, this is what you're feeling. You know, it's just all the loss of, you know, weddings and graduations and, you know, celebrations and eating out and concerts and, you know, whatever it is, you're feeling this tremendous sense of loss. And it's okay to feel bad about that, but sometimes we can't put our finger on it. So it's like something's off, but I just can't name it. And so when we say, okay, this is a normal reaction in a normal person, and this is a totally abnormal event that none of us have walked through before, that's a good thing to remind each other. So the goals of CISM are basically emotional first aid and triage. So I'm thinking if I come across a car wreck, or if I'm hiking on a trail and I come across somebody that's injured, what would I do, right? Well, you know, first, if it was a car wreck and I thought they were in danger, I'd, you know, pull that person off to the side and get them out of danger. Or, you know, I might apply pressure if somebody's bleeding to try to keep them from bleeding out, or whatever. We would calm them down. We would cover them with a blanket. We would call the professionals, right? So really, there's kind of 4 stages here, or 4 goals of CISM that you want to do when you find somebody who is experiencing, has experienced some sort of trauma. One is to stabilize them, right? And so sometimes that's stabilized to actually help them stand up and to just kind of get their bearings. They're dizzy, they're, you know, off kilter. And so some of you, if you have employees, you may have already done this. You've already brought people back and you're finding out kind of where they're at, kind of if they're whacked in the head or if they're doing okay, or maybe you've been doing this over the phone with some employees during this time. Mitigation really provides an opportunity for people to blow off that stress together. Now, they may have been doing that on Facebook already, ranting or whatever, but there's nothing like being together with people that you've worked with to process an event together. And sharing pain together is a recognized step in healing and reintegrating people into life. Prevention has to do with this idea that sometimes after an event, the stress around the event, not the actual car wreck, for example, but the stress of maybe, I don't know where my kids are, my kids, where are they at? Okay, your kids are going to be taken to your aunt's house or whatever. So it's the stress around the event. So trying to think about the things that can prevent the re-escalation of stress because of the actual incident. So, you know, the stress of re-entering public and not feeling safe, the stress of relearning new rhythms and doing everything virtual, the stress of being triggered off other people's stress, right? Changing financial realities, all those things, we want to work to prevent those things from kind of amping people back up again. And then there's just the assessment. And this is kind of that aspect of triage to determine who needs help and how am I going to help them. And this is really, if you supervise people, this is really where you get to shine as a supervisor. You've hired them, you've selected them for fit. Now is your chance to determine, okay, is this person like ready to go back to work in their current position? Or do we need to make some modifications? Do we need to, maybe they're ready to upgrade their skills, or if there's a lateral opportunity for them, or maybe they're not really ready to engage in work again. I have a friend who owns a business, and they have a guy who was kind of freaking out. This is the end of the world. There's a big conspiracy, whatever. And he, in his stress, was amping other people's stress up in the workplace. And so they kind of had to reassign him to some other duties and give him a mental health break and just say, just go home for a week. You know, take care of yourself and your family, and then let's talk again. And so we have to think about all of those kind of things as we walk through this. So this is our opportunity to kind of triage and kind of assess where people are at. So CISM, the idea of CISM is that we're moving people from one state, and then we're trying to get them to reintegration. Reintegration is really the goal. But, you know, so CISM classically is there's a hazardous event, there's a vulnerable state that it puts them in. And their vulnerable state is not necessarily just the disaster itself, it's what the disaster causes them to feel like. We're talking about stress management, right? So how does this cause them to feel, their interpretation of the event? How much of a threat or a loss or a challenge is it to them? And once again, some people, they don't really perceive this. We've all experienced this hazardous event, if you will, but not everybody is feeling vulnerable because of that. So some people are going to come back really no stress. Other people are going to come back and they've felt very vulnerable, and that's caused a precipitating factor. And that's what converts us from a vulnerable state into a crisis state. So sometimes the hazardous event, if you had coronavirus, that hazardous event is the precipitating factor. But for maybe some of us who are bystanders to the actual medical emergency, it's the fact that dad's suddenly out of work, and that's creating a financial crisis. And so that's the precipitating factor. All of that really doesn't matter. All we know is that if it moves people into this active crisis state where they're agitated and depressed and their cognitive ability, that's really what we're trying to assess and correct as we move them back towards reintegration. And the goal is to restore people to equilibrium, right? And that's dependent on a number of factors: their own personal ability to absorb stress, to absorb loss and change, for their ability to objectively evaluate was this really affecting you, or did you perceive it to be affecting you? You know, and our goal as employers is how do we help move them towards that as quickly as possible so that we can reintegrate them into the workforce as successfully as possible. So we might be able to facilitate hope and understanding and adaptive coping and encourage them to reframe an incident, and we'll talk about some of that. So maybe I would ask you this time, does anybody here have a time, maybe more of a classical disaster or crisis in your life, where you might be willing to talk about and share briefly how you walk through those phases? And I know that's kind of a vulnerable question to ask, but does anybody have anything like that that's happened in your life that you've seen this progress? All right, with a small audience, you never know, so I just thought I'd throw it out there. But we will all learn from this how to do this, I'm sure. Let's talk about this possibility of a meeting. If you have employees, we want to do two things. One is to diffuse, and one is to debrief. And the idea of diffusing is if a bomb's about to blow, we want to interrupt that circuit as soon as possible. A debriefing is more like analyzing, okay, how are we doing? Who made this bomb? How is it constructed? So there's two different things. One, we want to get people out from a highly agitated state so that they don't go, ballistic. And so that would be a diffusing. Debriefing is really about, let's talk through how this processed out for you. So you may have already, again, done some of this one-on-one with people, or maybe as a small group. People need to hear that they aren't actually the only ones that have experienced something hard. This is where we get to repeat our mantra. Post-traumatic stress is a normal reaction in a normal person in an abnormal situation. So they're going to learn from each other, and it's going to encourage them to walk through this together. It's best if you do this in a group to do it with people who are peers, who are kind of on the same level, or maybe even part of the same team. If there's too much dissonance between maybe the managers and the owners and what they've experienced versus what these people have experienced, that kind of cross-contamination of stress might not actually be useful. So people who are in kind of the same circumstances, of course, you don't know that until you get there, but that may be something that you can kind of guess at. And again, you want to keep this small, 6 to 8 people, so that everybody feels open enough that they can share. You want to keep it short and focused, having an agenda, really no more than 30 to 60 minutes. You don't want this to turn into a big, long drama gripe session where you're actually escalating people's stress because they're thinking all the other things they could be doing, right? So don't turn it into a marathon. Don't let people peel off. Have a very tightly focused agenda. And if you're going to have a staff meeting that follows it, okay, first we're going to do this and then a staff meeting, put a big break in between there so that there's time off. Again, this isn't a classical CISM activity, but I want to start going through kind of some of the models of this. The safer model is this: stabilizing the situation, acknowledging the crisis, facilitating understanding of what's happening by getting the facts, and also facilitating post-traumatic growth. We'll talk about that. Encouraging adaptive coping skills, and then restoring independent function. That's the reintegration. And if people need it, referring them for appropriate care to the appropriate place. You are not a counselor. You are not expected to be a counselor. I am not a counselor. Your goal is simply to triage and see who's ready to go back to work, who needs a little bit of help, who needs a lot of help, and get people to the right places. So I'm just going to talk kind of maybe a sample agenda that you might use. And the idea here is that you would, if you had a big group of people or a small group, 3 or 4 people, you could still do this. But it's really to kind of be kind of systematic about this and not shooting from your hip. So it's going to take some time to prepare for this, but you might sound like, well, thanks for coming in today. I know that some of us never really experienced anything like this before. I know I haven't in my lifetime. So before we get back to work, but it might be helpful for us to share some of how we're feeling and what we've been experiencing and what our reactions are since we've been apart from each other for 6 to 8 weeks. And so this isn't a time for us to explore conspiracy theories or gripe to one another. It's really talk about the stress that this crisis may have created for each one of us. And all of us have experienced this differently. And since one of our stated values as a company is people come first, I want us to practice this right now before we get busy again. Now, nobody has to share, but I really want to encourage, at least you contribute something to the conversation if you feel comfortable. That's going to help other people open up if you open up. But also, let's consider the needs of others. If you're maybe not hearing other people share, maybe you need to take a breath and let them step in. And it's also okay if we have some silence here as we kind of process what we're hearing. Now, I know some of the things, sometimes we like to take things back from the office and share them with our spouses or our families. And normally that's probably okay, but maybe for this meeting, we could agree that whatever is shared is just going to stay in this room unless somebody says specifically that it's okay for them to share. And then I also want you to know that as your employer, I'm really dedicated to keeping what's shared here also in this room. I want to keep you employed best I can. We're not going to use anything shared in this room to determine whether you're going to be an employee here in the future or not. And I want to give you my commitment as your employer that this is just an opportunity for you to process your stress. So how does that sound, everybody? Does anybody have any question about our ground rules? So that might be an example of an introduction. You're kind of setting the framework for where you're going, what the expectations are, what commitments you're willing to make to them, and what commitments they should make to you, and what it is and what it isn't going to be about. So then you might go on and start exploring where people are. And this is really kind of a fact gathering opportunity. So when you first heard about the stay-at-home order, what were your thoughts, Jane? Would you share? Or maybe you don't call them out, but you put the question out there. How was your time during the stay at home order and business closure? What kind of thoughts did you have when the order was lifted? And again, keeping this group small, 6 to 8 people, you want everybody to have an opportunity to share. If this is 10, 12 more people, people are just going to sit in a corner who aren't natural about sharing, and they're going to be quiet. And so you need to keep that small. There's no need to rush the process. This is an opportunity for there to be a little bit of awkward silence, and that's okay. People need time to open up and feel safe. If nobody's opening up, then you might even start with your feelings and be vulnerable. And what that says to people, if you can do that, is yes, we're really going to go there. And when you are able to be vulnerable first, it says, oh, I actually have permission to be to open myself up here. And that's going to be really important for people. The next thing to think about is to start looking at reactions and start monitoring that. So what's likely is going to come out, right, is maybe fears or guilt that this didn't affect them as much as it did somebody else, or frustration with how long this went on, stay-at-home orders, all those types of things are going to come out. And so you want at this point to allow all feelings to be expressed. If they get emotional and they're crying, or even if they've got some anger, that's okay. If somebody starts maybe clamming up because all of a sudden they went there and then they drew back, oh, I'm not used to sharing my feelings here. You know, John, it's okay for you to be angry and sad at the same time. And you can cry here. This is a safe place for you to do that. What you're experiencing is a normal reaction, John, in a normal person in an abnormal situation. So that's okay for you to do that. Again, we need to use that phrase to reassure people that that stress is something that they're experiencing that's normal. Now, obviously, if a person doesn't want to say anymore, you could say, you know, has anybody else experienced any emotions like John has just shared? Thank you, John. Thank you for being so courageous and open with us. So it's really important to appreciate people's willingness to be vulnerable and courageous about that. Symptoms. Now, this is where, again, your observation skills, you kind of want to be eagle eye here without looking like you're being eagle eye. So you're watching for symptoms of ongoing and high level stress and how that might affect their ability to re-engage the workplace. So asking how their life has changed during this time, or have they been coping with the stress? And so here's where these symptoms, where you go, okay, here's the signs of stress. Now, we all know what stress feels like. If you've been a small business owner, you know what stress feels like. But how you experience stress and how other people experience stress, especially this one, it's going to be different. And so you're looking for all sorts of signs as people are expressing their feelings and their experiences. This is how you're going to start kind of being that armchair psychiatrist, but not quite a psychiatrist, and to try to listen through. You're not trying to diagnose them. You're not trying to tell them how to take care of their health. What you're trying to do is look for signs that, okay, something deeper is going on here that we need to pay attention to. So how many will admit, and that you could even do this, hey, how many of us here have experienced like you just feel like you're in this fog bank and like, whoa, I can't even concentrate, right? And so maybe many of us have been experienced that, where you're muddle-headed and you can't keep your paperwork organized and you forget appointments, right? So by starting maybe with some things that are more common about what people might have experienced, you're giving them permission to share about those things. But again, as people are opening up, they might express some of these types of things, and you're going to listen through for those. So then teaching, the next step in a meeting is to explain the stress response syndrome. And again, this is your mantra, you know, what you guys have been experiencing, what you're talking about, that is so normal. I've been experiencing that too. This is a normal reaction in normal people to an abnormal situation. I really want us to hear that these types of things are normal. And that takes away shame. That allows people to be honest about where they're at. And that's so important in any workplace. And so we'll be talking about some of the positive coping skills that you might teach them or encourage them in. We'll be talking about that on June 5th, and I'll share about that at the end. But encouraging those positive coping skills, you know, being outside, doing what restores you, doing what refreshes you, being around people in your family or the virtual cocktail hours or getting out on the street or whatever. Help people to encourage them to resume their normality. This is really difficult in our household right now, trying to keep 4 different kids, college age down to 8th grade, on the same schedule. But my wife and I are trying desperately to keep our normal work routines, because guess what? We're still working. and we're trying to encourage our kids, okay, TV's off at 11, lights out, please, because, this one's still going to school just because you're not. And so trying to get people into a normal rhythm so that they can get back to work in that rhythm is a good encouragement. Of course, negative coping skills. We've probably all done this, maybe a little bit more than we're used to during this time, but we really want to help people in a single incident crisis moment. This is really critical because cortisol is released into our bodies, and after a critical incident. And if we don't hydrate ourselves, or if we use alcohol, or if we're not getting good sleep, that is going to hang around in our body, and it's going to cause ongoing issues. And so it's really important to help people think about negative coping skills and trying to avoid those, and what are the positive coping skills. And then one of the things that I've already violated this with my kids is encouraged to avoiding life-changing decisions right now. And I've already asked my son during this stressful time, so what are you thinking after college? And do you want to live here this summer? And, all these things is like, I know better than this. Oh my goodness. We need to help people. Let's just take a breath right now. And we don't have to make any big decisions that we don't need to right now. It's good for us just to take a breath. And when we're on the other side and maybe thinking more clearly, then you can go back to thinking about some of those bigger things. And then wrapping it up, reinforcing those coping strategies, maybe summarizing what you heard people say, repeating back so that they know you were listening, offering those support systems, which I'll talk about in a bit, and then encouraging people to talk to each other, respecting confidentiality, adjourn, but stick around if people want to share. Our goal of the meeting, it might sound like this. Remember, our goal of this meeting was to provide a safe place for us to begin to process some stress with one another if you feel safe doing that. And it's not a one and done. If you need to do that some more with each other, I encourage you to do so. We may need to come back to this as a group. So it's just that kind of summarizing and wrapping up the things that you agreed to at the beginning. And then this is critical. Now, you may not be able to do this within your company because you may have nobody to debrief you, but it's really important that you take time to do this very shortly after the meeting. First of all, I encourage you, don't take notes during the meeting. People are less likely to share openly and honestly with you if you're sitting there and Jane is drinking excessively, whatever. It's probably better for you to do this meeting as soon as you can afterwards, jot your notes down as best you can. And if somebody else was in the meeting with you, or even if they weren't, then it's good just for you to talk through that, because your stress of managing a company and employees is different from their stress of being an employee. So here's where you're writing down, wow, Jane, she's really drinking heavily. I kind of need to make sure that this isn't going to affect her working life. She may need a referral for something like this. So this is where you're thinking about who needs referral and resource, who can go right back to work. Jim, he's doing great. Just put him back on the job. Susie, boy, I don't know. We might need to shift her to some different responsibilities. So here's your opportunity to make some observations and some judgments about this. What worked in the meeting, what didn't, in case you come back to it, and then processing your own reaction. It might actually cause you stress to hear about their stress because you're thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to be down 2 employees. How am I going to deal with this? So discussing plans for future group meetings or individual processing with another person might be useful. So I want to stop right there before we move a little further and say, so far, what are your thoughts about a meeting like that? Have you ever maybe been through a meeting like that? And how might you implement something like that in your business? Christina, Vicky, Megan, or Sarah?
Steve. This is Sarah. Yeah, this has been interesting for us just because we actually kind of did this backwards. We didn't think enough ahead about what we should be doing before we come back to work, and instead went ahead and said, okay, we've been doing really well at home. We've been checking in with each other, kind of doing the things you're saying and making sure that people are feeling comfortable. But then we did decide, okay, we're going to come back up to work on this day. And we got here that Monday and people immediately felt uncomfortable. And you could tell just by kind of the atmosphere and environment. And it was an immediate thing that I wanted to jump on and address. And so I wish we would have done a little bit better job of reaching out to people beforehand, because that's one thing I will say, even this small group meeting that you're discussing, I think it kind of depends on your office too, the number of employees you have. What we found was that we had reached out to folks and said, hey, this is our plan. If you have any concerns, questions, please let us know. But people did not reach out. And I don't know if it's because they weren't sure what they would feel come Monday, or if they didn't feel comfortable sharing to others or whatever. What I found was really helpful was a one-on-one conversation with a lot of folks and just reaching out to them personally and saying, how are you doing? I think people feel a little bit more comfortable sometimes, especially with these tough conversations, with a one-on-one discussion. And so that's one takeaway that I learned is, yes, I think this is incredibly important to do, to reach out to people and see how they're doing and try to address their concerns up front. But sometimes those one-on-one conversations can actually be more effective depending on the group of people.
Yeah, good. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody else, Christina, Vicki, or Megan, want to pop in on here?
As the Idaho Women's Business Center, we are a really small team and we're still working from home. Some people, like a couple of them, are in the office, but not just because stereotypically we're women and like to talk about our feelings, but we are mostly a team of women and we do quite often talk how we're feeling. So I think as a team, we have a very good grasp of how every person in our team is doing right now, which has been really great and really supportive when someone needs a hand. Like we've been there for each other. I think having a debrief once this is over would also be nice. So just because we can look at it like, okay, we're going to move on from what is occurring and maybe what is the next step for the Idaho Women's Business Center. So
yeah, good.
And I would, sorry.
Go ahead, Megan.
I was just going to add on to the fact that like it's been interesting to talk to a lot of people as the business center, like hearing where a lot of pain points are, and then a lot of my own work is in the corporate space, and a lot of things like this would be easier and more natural for people who are more inclined to have a culture where they seem to care about their team anyway. So what's been interesting is hearing things being even rockier because people didn't know how to implement or not. Always been coming from a corporate background. I worked in corporate for 15 years too, and there was always the divide of like, you're supposed to show up to work and you leave your personal life at home. And I think thankfully societally that's not as much of a problem, but it's definitely something that hopefully, even if people didn't get on this ball during the crisis now, that these are things that people recognize would be super important to get better at. And so it's not as jarring, or like people wouldn't have to feel like, is this a safe place to say things, if they already feel genuinely validated as individuals all the time.
Good, great insight. Vicki?
This meeting that you're describing seems like a real good transition to me. We do weekly meetings and we talk all the time. So, I feel like I'm pretty much on top of how everybody's been dealing. We're a small enough team that we know, and I can see signs of stress in some people to kind of have clues where we're going to need to make sure that we're supporting them. But we've talked about just, maybe meeting at a park outside where we can all kind of sit in the same area and look at each other face to face. And this sounds like a great structure for that kind of meeting. Just, let's get it out there and really talk about how we've been feeling. We talked about kids that are screaming or one kid's crying, so everyone has to yell louder to be heard over them. And but yeah, how that really has affected everybody, kind of almost like taking cleansing breath. Okay, let's get ready to move on, kind of join it.
Yeah, good.
Like excited by it.
Yeah, I like that. And I want to reflect on something that Megan said, which is this is an opportunity really in terms of workplace culture for us to reset anything that was off. And so if before maybe the culture wasn't as caring or wasn't as personal or intimate and it was just show up and do your job, now we have the opportunity to say, you know what? We're all under a lot of stress and we may be under stress for a period of time here. We can begin to integrate some more opportunities like this to share with each other and check in. And I think what it does for me is it allows me to see, so I work in the medical cultural realm where doctors are supposed to be perfect and doctors are supposed to be tough and doctors are supposed to be superheroes. And of course, you see the burnout rate and the physician suicide rate that comes along with that kind of culture is crazy. And so for us, this is an opportunity to reset the culture and say, hey, maybe that tough guy culture, it's time to retire that. And it's time for us to embrace a different type of way that we do business. So in all of the places, whether they're places of our own workplace or whether they're places, as Megan was talking, that she can influence corporate culture as she consults with people, I think these are some really important messages for us to say, you know, and another analogy I've been using is like, this is an epic flood of biblical proportions. And as we begin to look at the landscape, why not begin to carve out some new channels of humanity and compassion in our workplaces that weren't there before? And so this really is an opportunity for us to reset those things. So as we think through some of the techniques, if you're facilitating this, is that, well, let me just start by saying the facilitator doesn't have to be you. In fact, depending on the business, it might be better that if it's not you. You may have a friend that could do this really well. If you have a insurance policy that has an EAP program, you might be able to actually call them and say, can you send in a counselor, a psychologist to run a meeting that knows how to do this? The point is, if you're going to do this, you have to be the calmest, coolest cat in the room, or it needs to be someone who is, who doesn't feel so rigid or uncomfortable doing that. And so that could be somebody on staff that, or another friend or another business owner or something like that. So you can see here, I'm not going to read these, but facilitator techniques in terms of active listening is that whoever it is, you want them to be very skillful at listening, taking time, leaving lots of space, and demonstrating some of those techniques that we're going to talk about on June 5th. Offering resources, really important here. Of course, the Idaho Suicide Prevention Hotline has both their call as well as their text, and you can chat at their website. If you do have an EAP program, pointing people to that. If you don't, there is an Ada County mobile crisis unit for somebody who's in a bad place. But you don't have to be suicidal to call the Suicide Prevention Hotline. In fact, you don't even have to be the person experiencing a stressful experience. If you're worried about someone who you think might be suicidal or might be moving in that direction, or if you make the call with them, you can actually use that line as a resource for yourself. If you see someone that is feeling hopeless and gloomy and despondent and has no hope for the future, those are some really good resources for you to reach out to and to offer to your employees as well. Get a pack of those Suicide Prevention Hotline cards. So accommodations, some of you may already be making accommodations for people, whether that's remote working, working from home, whether there's some sort of reassignment, upgrade, lateral downgrade, flexible hours, and then just the understanding. People are not at the top of their game. Again, my wife and I are having a lot of difficulty adapting the expectations that we have for our children during this time. It's hard enough that we're home all the time, two type A parents, looking in on their lives, and that's hard enough, but we have to lower our expectations of the amount of stress that those who are just looking to get ready and moving into their career might be experiencing all the uncertainty that goes with that. How this is just completely swamped or just discombobulated their world. And so I think for all of us, more understanding, letting people not be at 100%, understanding that people are muddy or maybe forgetting appointments or not clearly communicating as well as they used to. And I really believe that this is the leadership challenge, I think, of our lifetimes, those of us who are in positions of influence or ownership, and the way that we treat those people that we have responsibility for and influence over, I really think it's going to affect their loyalty towards us for the rest of their lives. If we respond to people in this time with compassion and humanity and a deep sense of caring, concern, and understanding, they're going to remember that forever, and it could have such an influence on them. So I might like to ask here, although probably Vicky's the only one here that has employees that you're supervising, have there already been ways maybe that you're accommodating employees or that you're thinking of accommodating them? But I'll allow anybody to jump in. Certainly, Sarah, you could jump in too.
We actually were pretty well positioned for most people. We had already done remote working, so we had probably more than half of us already work from home some days. I was probably the least prepared. I had my modem fry, the day that I started to work from home, so I had to go, scramble to get a modem. We do have someone who's immune compromised, and he's the one person that really needs to come into our office to do his job. So we've been very much about protecting him. So he comes in 2 days a week to do his job. There's nobody else in the office on those days. I go in 1 day a week to do my job, part of which is printing checks. The person who has to sign them comes in 2 days later and signs them, and then I don't touch them again for another 4 days. So we've been really good at a team of working around what needs to be done and prioritizing who needs to be, their health really needs to be protected. Now we're in a position where I've got one guy who's working from home with 2 little kids. His wife's at home. They've got a 2-bedroom apartment. So this guy needs to get back in the office as soon as possible, for his mental health. He's got to get out of there.
Yes, get me out of the kids.
Yeah. How do we protect everybody and kind of integrate and bring them back in? But yeah, we've been really lucky. Flexible hours, flexible days. We're not quite as productive as we were before, but our customers, our sales have gone down too, which has kind of been a blessing that we can, okay, you only need to be there 2 days a week instead of having to be there 5 days a week. So,
yeah,
it's working.
Good. Anybody else have any thoughts?
Yeah, and here at our office, we that first day we got back and realized that we needed to do a little bit better job of trying to understand what employees' concerns were. We tried to make a better effort to reassure people that if they do feel more comfortable working at home right now, that's okay, and that we will accommodate that, and just work with them individually, one-on-one, to make it so that they just are working the best they can and feeling safe and secure, because that's the most important thing. And so we are letting people do that, and then we're just going to kind of see how that goes over time. And we're kind of struggling with that. What does that look like moving forward? If people do want to work from home more, are we going to allow that? There's a lot of those kinds of business decisions that are going to come from this as well, which is going to be interesting. And so we're just doing our best to hear what people have to say and working with them.
Very good. Good. Well, let's move towards the end of this. I want to talk about this concept of encouraging post-traumatic growth. And it's a phrase I heard a few weeks ago in a webinar. And so I started digging around on it, and I found some really cool stuff that we're going to probably do some presentations on for our membership later on this summer into the fall. In fact, the little circle, little wheel there that you see is a graphic from the website at the bottom, which has a bunch of really cool graphics. And anyway, the idea here is that there's research done on post-traumatic growth, not perhaps in a situation like this, but trauma in general, that talks about different areas of reframing rather than being a victim, thinking about how do I use this to bounce off the bottom, and really develop other areas. And these are the 5 domains in terms of post-traumatic growth that have been researched that are common areas for people to grow in afterwards. And I really love them: close relationships, greater appreciation for life, new possibilities, spiritual development, and personal strength. And I see all of those things happening in different members of my family and other friends of mine. Helping people to be grateful. Gratitude is definitely a well-researched thing in terms of being scientifically proven to help people, that it can be more effective than a long-term SSRI. There's a book called 3 Good Things that documents that kind of a thing. So helping people be grateful, and maybe that becomes a new practice that you introduce in your workplace, a board where people can write it, or thank you notes to each other, or whatever that is. And then really helping people look forward. It's so easy when you're in the middle of a crisis just to stay stuck, head down, focus on feet in front of you, and to help them get their eyes up again, look at the big picture again. And obviously, if a person's in shock, if a person is experiencing high levels of stress, you can't expect any of these types of things. You're just trying to help them to move lower on that stress scale. This is really for people who moved out of that active crisis state and have begun to reintegrate. And so don't expect people who are in an active crisis state to think with gratitude for all the things that are happening here. It might be a tool that they use to get towards reintegration, but we also can't be expecting people just to kind of snap to and get back to it and reframe so quickly. This really is the reintegration step. And then if you want, we'll of course have these slides available. Christina can make these available, but if you just do a search for CISM Cards Crisis Response Care, you'll come up with this from a fire department in California, I think it is. And it basically has all of what I've just given you is pretty much all in card format, and you can walk through that and use that as an outline. And then of course, these slides. But again, to summarize, stress is a normal response to a crisis for a normal human being in an abnormal situation. So compassionately helping people move forward is the leadership opportunity of our lifetime and of this moment. And I think that we will all do well to do that. So I want to encourage you to think about joining us on Friday, June 5th. I'm going to talk about something I do a presentation on a lot more often than this. This is the first time I've done the CISM exploration, but I do one called Self-Care Under Stress Bouncing Apparatus, and it is that idea: how do we prepare ourselves to bounce off of hard things in life and to have enough room in our life to absorb the impact of difficult things? Because there's the organizational things that we do for people, but we also have to help our employees more and more learn this idea of self-care, and that you have permission to take care of yourself. And we want to build workplace cultures that encourage people to take care of themselves rather than abusing themselves by overworking, expecting perfection of each other or themselves, and those types of things that really ratchet up the stress in our life and cause us to crash when we can't handle it anymore. So with that, I kind of want to finish up here and ask if there's any other questions or comments that you guys want to make about the topic we've been exploring today. Very good. Oh, go ahead, Megan.
I was just gonna say, not so much questions, but this was super helpful. It's so funny how sometimes things, when we're in overwhelm, it almost seems like stuff is more challenging than it needs to. So I liked a lot of the kind of bare bones of things that are not actually that hard if you kind of just implement them strategically and intentionally.
Well, you know, Megan, being overwhelmed is a normal reaction in a normal person in an abnormal situation.
I recently heard that from a very intelligent facilitator.
Vicki, did you have something too?
No, I didn't have any questions, but I think this was this was really helpful. I'm looking forward to the presentation on the 5th. Yeah, there's a lot happening, and just going back to, you know, being human and treating each other well, and that's what it comes back to. So I love hearing that this is in that moment, and stick with that.
Yeah, good. Well, Christina.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Absolutely, it was my pleasure. And I'm glad that we got to do this as a discussion and not me going through a bunch of slides. That was way more fun.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I invite everyone that's here today to join us again on June 5th from 1 to 2. I think we really appreciate it. And I think it's going to be great, just like this one was. So thank you.
Very good. Thanks all. And we'll see you again. Take care of yourselves.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Bye.